The forest had always called to Daniel. Its whispers in the wind, the scent of pine, the unbroken solitude, it was his escape. When city life grew unbearable, he would load his pack and vanish into the woods for days. He reveled in the silence, the isolation, the challenge of survival against nature. But his latest trip would prove that solitude had its own dangers. Daniel arrived at Raven's Hollow late in the afternoon, a secluded pocket of wilderness he'd never explored. Local legends painted it as cursed ground, but he scoffed at such tales. Ghost stories were for tourists and children. He pitched his tent at the edge of a small clearing and set about building a fire. The sun dipped low, casting the forest in shadow, but Daniel felt at peace, alone, as he liked it. By the time night fully claimed the forest, Daniel was seated by the fire, staring into its dancing flames. The woods were alive with the usual sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, distant hoots of an owl. He sipped from his canteen and leaned back, letting the warmth of the fire lull him. That's when he heard it, a low, guttural sound like a breath drawn too close to his ear. He froze, heart thudding in his chest. The sound came again, more distinct this time. A growl, or was it a groan? Daniel grabbed his flashlight and swept its beam into the trees. The light carved through the darkness, revealing nothing but trunks and undergrowth. He told himself it was a distant animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. Still, he kept the flashlight close and his knife closer. The forest settled once more, but his sense of peace was shattered. Daniel stayed awake longer than usual, listening for any sound out of place. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he crawled into his tent, sealing the zipper as if it were a lock against the unknown. He woke abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. The fire was a dim glow outside, but something else had roused him, a faint tapping, soft and deliberate, like fingertips against fabric. He held his breath, straining to listen. The tapping came again, this time louder. It was on his tent. Fear wrapped around him like a vice. He reached for his flashlight with trembling hands and clicked it on, illuminating the interior of the tent. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came the whisper. Daniel. His name, faint but unmistakable, spoken in a voice not his own. It was outside, close, impossibly close. He clenched his knife, his fingers slick with sweat, and sat frozen. The flashlight beam wavered as his hand shook. Who's there? He called, his voice cracking answer. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. Gathering his courage, Daniel unzipped the tent and thrust the flashlight out. The beam revealed the clearing, empty save for his dying fire. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, but there was no one. No footprints. No sign of anything amiss. He stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The air was colder than it should have been, biting against his skin. He circled the campsite, scanning every inch, but found nothing. Just the woods, dark and indifferent, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Daniel rekindled the fire, feeding it until the flames roared, chasing away the night's chill. Sleep was impossible now. He sat with his back to the fire, watching the forest, daring whatever was out there to show itself. But the night passed without further incident. The next morning, he considered packing up and leaving, but pride held him back. He wasn't about to let some figment of his imagination scare him off. It was just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Determined to shake the unease, he spent the day hiking deeper into the woods, mapping the terrain and snapping photos. By evening, he felt more like himself. But the night brought the fear back with a vengeance. The fire crackled merrily, a comforting presence as the darkness closed in. Daniel had just begun to relax when he heard it again, the whisper of his name. This time, it wasn't faint. It came from the opposite side of the fire. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed only empty air. His pulse thundered in his ears as he scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Daniel, the voice repeated, louder now, closer. Show yourself, he shouted, his voice ringing through the clearing. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. At first, it looked human. A man draped in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. But as the figure moved into the firelight, Daniel's stomach churned with terror. The face beneath the hood was not a face at all, but a pale, featureless expanse, smooth as porcelain. Daniel stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. The thing tilted its head as if studying him. It took another step forward, and Daniel felt his body lock up, paralyzed by an unseen force. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. The creature raised a hand, bony fingers pointing directly at him. The fire blazed higher, its flames turning an unnatural blue. The forest seemed to close in, the trees bending and twisting as if alive. Daniel's vision blurred, his head pounding with an unbearable pressure. The last thing he saw before blacking out was the creature's featureless face, inches from his own. When Daniel woke, it was morning. He lay sprawled on the forest floor, his gear scattered around him. The tent was shredded, the fire pit cold and undisturbed. His body ached as if he'd been thrown about. He scrambled to his feet, looking around frantically. There was no sign of the creature, no footprints, no evidence of what had happened, only the oppressive silence of the woods. He didn't bother packing properly. Grabbing what he could, Daniel fled, crashing through the underbrush until he reached his car. He drove without stopping, his heart racing long after the forest disappeared in his rearview mirror. Daniel never went camping again. The forest had called to him, and he had answered. But now he knew he wasn't the only one listening. The cabin deep in the woods wasn't supposed to be there. Andrew had spent years hiking and camping, priding himself on his knowledge of the wilderness. When he stumbled across the dilapidated structure hidden behind a wall of gnarled trees, it filled him with a mix of curiosity and unease. The structure was old, its wood rotting, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Yet something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong in this time or this world. It was his third night of camping alone, a trip meant to clear his head after a messy breakup. The forest had always been his sanctuary, but now it felt different. As the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the forest grew too quiet. No chirping of crickets, no rustle of nocturnal animals, just an oppressive silence that pressed against his ears. Andrew couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. He'd come across it earlier in the day and had almost turned back to investigate, but something held him back. It wasn't just its decrepit state, it was the feeling it exuded, as though the air around it was thicker, heavier. Against his better judgment, he decided to go back. Maybe facing the source of his unease would dispel it. With his flashlight in hand and his knife strapped to his belt, he made his way through the forest. The path he'd taken earlier seemed harder to follow now, the trees denser, their limbs clawing at him like skeletal hands. When he finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, he hesitated. The structure loomed in the moonlight, more menacing than it had in the day. Its door hung ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Andrew scanned the area with his flashlight, but the beam seemed to falter, as if the darkness here was thicker, more resistant. He swallowed hard and stepped closer. The interior of the cabin smelled of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with crude carvings, symbols that Andrew didn't recognize but felt were deeply wrong. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, their lines etched with a precision that didn't match the crude state of the cabin. A broken table sat in the center of the room, its surface gouged with deep scratches. On the far wall hung a mirror, its surface covered in grime. Andrew felt a chill as he approached it. Something about the mirror drew his gaze, though he couldn't say why. When he wiped the surface clean, he regretted it instantly. The reflection didn't match the room. While the real cabin was empty and decrepit, the mirror showed a space alive with movement. Shadows flitted across the reflected room, too fast to be human. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, and the scratches on the table bled as though freshly made. But worst of all, standing in the center of the reflected room was a figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with glowing eyes that stared directly at Andrew. He staggered back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The reflection didn't change. The figure remained in the mirror, watching him. Its mouth twisted into a grin, sharp teeth glinting. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed, not at his reflection, but directly at him. A deafening slam shattered the silence as the cabin door slammed shut. Andrew spun around, his flashlight beam darting wildly, but no one was there. The air grew colder, his breath visible in the beam of light. He reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the cabin itself was holding him prisoner. Behind him, the mirror cracked, the sound sharp as a gunshot. He turned just in time to see the stiff figure step out of the glass, its movements fluid and unnatural. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending the wrong way as it crawled toward him like a spider. Its glowing eyes locked onto his, and Andrew felt a paralyzing wave of dread wash over him. He backed away, stumbling over debris, until his back hit the wall. The creature stopped inches away, its breath cold against his skin. It opened its mouth, and a voice emerged. Not a growl, not a scream, but a whisper, layered with countless other voices. "You shouldn't have come here." The lights from his flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed the cabin, and Andrew's scream was the last sound that echoed through the trees. The next morning, a group of hikers found his campsite abandoned. His tent was intact, his belongings untouched, but there was no sign of Andrew. The forest seemed quieter than usual, the air heavier as though holding its breath. Far from the campsite, hidden behind a wall of gnarled trees, the old cabin waited, its door creaking softly in the breeze. Inside, a new carving had appeared on the wall, a figure etched in agonizing detail, its face frozen in a silent scream. The road had been endless, a ribbon of asphalt stretching through the desolate wilderness. Emily was on her way to meet friends at a remote cabin, the promise of laughter and relaxation urging her forward. But when her GPS lost signal and the gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, she had no choice but to pull over at the only sign of life for miles, a lonely, decrepit rest stop nestled in the woods. The building looked abandoned, its paint peeling and windows grimy with age. A flickering fluorescent light above the entrance buzzed faintly, the only sign of power. Emily hesitated, the hairs on her arms prickling with unease. But desperation won out, and she stepped inside. The air was stale, tinged with the metallic scent of rust. The room was empty, except for a vending machine humming in the corner and a few mismatched chairs scattered near a dusty bulletin board. A single light bulb swung overhead, casting jittery shadows across the walls. Emily glanced around, her footsteps echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The vending machine's offerings were ancient, the candy bars warped and the chips' packaging faded. She opted for a bottle of water, the machine groaning as it delivered her choice. She twisted off the cap and drank deeply, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave her. Her eyes darted toward the bathroom door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar and revealing nothing but darkness beyond. A muffled sound came from the bathroom, a shuffle, faint but distinct. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice cracking. There was no reply. She waited, straining to hear over the relentless hum of the vending machine. Another sound followed, this one more deliberate, a soft knock, rhythmic and slow, coming from the other side of the door. She took a step back, clutching the water bottle like a weapon. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but her curiosity kept her rooted to the spot. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so profound it felt suffocating. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and unnaturally long, slipping out from the gap in the door. The fingers curled around the edge, their joints bending at impossible angles. Emily gasped, stumbling backward, her water bottle falling to the floor and rolling away. The hand withdrew as silently as it had appeared, leaving the door swaying slightly in its wake. She bolted for the exit, her shoes skidding on the dirty tiles. As she reached for the handle, a deep voice echoed from behind her, low and guttural. "Stay." She froze, the single word chilling her to her core. Against her better judgment, she turned, and what she saw would haunt her forever. The bathroom door had swung open wide, revealing a figure that barely fit through the frame. Its body was emaciated, its skin stretched taut over protruding bones. The head was too large, its face obscured by a tangle of hair that swayed like it had a life of its own. It crouched unnaturally, its limbs contorted, and when it moved, it scuttled forward like an insect. Emily screamed, wrenching the door open and running to her car. Her keys fumbled in her hands, but she managed to start the engine and peel out onto the road. In her rearview mirror, she saw the rest stop growing smaller, the figure now standing at the edge of the lot, watching her. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. Its image was seared into her mind. She drove through the night, not daring to stop again until she reached her friend's cabin. They found her trembling, pale, unable to speak about what she'd seen. When she finally did, they laughed nervously, brushing it off as exhaustion or an overactive imagination. But Emily knew better. She would never take that route again, and she would never forget the creature lurking in that forsaken rest stop, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to wander into its domain. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from the city, a weekend at a hidden gem of a campsite deep in the wilderness. Kate had found it through an online forum described as perfectly secluded, untouched, and peaceful. The directions were oddly specific, guiding her down narrow dirt roads and through dense thickets, until she reached a clearing surrounded by towering pines. She was alone, just as she'd hoped. She pitched her tent as the late afternoon sun cast golden light through the trees. The forest was alive with birdsong and the occasional scampering of unseen creatures. It felt like a dream. Kate built a small fire, ate a quick meal, and settled into a folding chair with a book. As dusk fell, the forest changed. The birds fell silent, their songs replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant cracking of branches. She dismissed it as the normal activity of nocturnal animals, but when she heard a low, deliberate whistle, a single drawn-out note, she froze. Kate sat motionless, straining to hear. The whistle came again, this time from a different direction. It didn't sound like a bird or any animal she knew. It was too precise, too deliberate. She grabbed her flashlight and scanned the trees, her beam slicing through the encroaching darkness. Nothing. She told herself it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe a trick of the trees. Still, her nerves kept her alert as she climbed into her tent and zipped it shut. The forest outside was pitch black, the fire reduced to glowing embers. Kate wrapped herself in her sleeping bag, clutching her flashlight tightly. The whistle came again, louder this time and closer. It was joined by another, fainter one, echoing from the opposite direction. Kate's chest tightened. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal. She turned the flashlight on and pointed it at the tent's fabric, casting a pale glow inside. She felt trapped, exposed. And then, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves just outside her tent. She froze, holding her breath. The steps stopped directly beside her. She could see the shadow of a figure through the thin material of the tent, tall and unmoving. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. The shadow lingered, its presence suffocating. Then, slowly, it began to move around the tent, circling her. Kate's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't cooperate. The circling stopped at the front of the tent where the zipper was. Her flashlight began to flicker. "No, no, no," she whispered, smacking it against her palm. The light failed entirely, plunging her into darkness. The tent's zipper began to slide down, inch by agonizing inch. Kate scrambled backward, clutching her knife from her pack. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice breaking. The zipper stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air. And then, laughter. Low and guttural, like it was coming from more than one throat at once. Kate's heart pounded as she pressed herself against the far wall of the tent. The laughter grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. The forest was silent again, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Kate waited, knife in hand, until the first light of dawn began to seep through the tent. She unzipped it cautiously, peeking out. The clearing was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything having been there. But something was wrong. The campsite was different. The trees were closer, their gnarled branches almost touching her tent. The fire pit was gone, replaced by a patch of untouched earth. Her belongings were scattered as if they'd been rifled through. And etched into the dirt in front of her tent was a single word: leave. She didn't need another warning. She packed up in record time and bolted back to her car, not daring to look back. When she finally reached the safety of her vehicle, she glanced at her phone. The time showed 2 hours earlier than it should have been. Her map app placed her miles from where she'd started, in a part of the forest she hadn't entered. Kate never camped again. She deleted the forum where she'd found the site and refused to talk about what happened. But sometimes late at night, when the wind whistles through the trees, she swears she hears that same low, deliberate note and the laughter that followed it. The lake was perfectly still, its glassy surface reflecting the full moon hanging in the sky. Jack had always loved night fishing, the solitude and the quiet lapping of water against his small aluminum boat. Tonight was no different, or so he thought. He had heard the stories about Lake Hollow's curse, whispered by the old-timers at the bait shop. They said people had vanished here, their boats found drifting empty. Jack had dismissed it as nonsense, campfire tales meant to scare newcomers. After all, he'd fished this lake dozens of times without incident. But tonight, the lake felt different. It started with the fog. Thin tendrils of mist curled up from the surface, snaking across the water as the night deepened. Jack ignored it, focusing on the gentle tug of his fishing line. The crickets had gone silent, and even the occasional splash of fish had ceased. He chalked it up to the cold air. Fish hunker down when it gets chilly, he reminded himself. A sudden chill ran through him, raising the hairs on his arms. He glanced around, squinting into the fog. He could barely see the shoreline anymore, the world around him swallowed by an oppressive gray. Then he heard it, a faint splash, too loud to be a fish. It was deliberate, like something large moving beneath the surface. Jack tightened his grip on his fishing rod, his eyes darting across the water. Probably a big carp, he muttered to himself, but his voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the thick air. The splash came again, this time behind him. He spun the boat, his flashlight cutting through the mist, but there was nothing. The light wavered as his hands began to tremble. The fog seemed to thicken, closing in on him, and then he saw it. Ripples spreading across the water, as if something massive was circling his boat. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" No answer. Just the sound of water slapping against the hull. The ripples stopped, the lake going eerily calm once more. Jack sat frozen, his mind racing. He decided it was time to head back. He reeled in his line quickly and reached for the oars. That's when he felt the boat tilt. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, but enough to make his heart hammer. He looked over the edge, peering into the inky blackness below. The water was unnaturally dark, hiding whatever might be beneath. Jack grabbed his flashlight again, shining it into the depths. But the beam only penetrated a few feet before fading. Something moved. It was quick, a shadow darting just beyond the flashlight's range. Jack dropped the light in panic, the clatter echoing across the silent lake. He scrambled for the oars, pulling hard against the water, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The boat lurched violently to the side, nearly tipping him over. Jack screamed, clutching the edges as he scrambled to stay inside. Something had hit the boat. Hard. The ripples returned, circling him faster now, closer. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking. He rowed harder, the fog swallowing the sound of his frantic splashes. Then from the corner of his eye, he saw it, a pale hand rising from the water. Its fingers were impossibly long, dripping with lake water, and its skin was translucent, revealing veins that pulsed with a sickly glow. The hand clawed at the side of the boat, gripping it with inhuman strength. Jack screamed and swung an oar at it, the wood splintering as it connected. The hand recoiled, disappearing beneath the surface, but the boat tilted again, harder this time. He knew he was out of time. As he rowed desperately, he felt something brush against his foot. He looked down to see water seeping into the boat, but not from a hole. It was rising, bubbling up unnaturally from the center. Panic surged through him as the water climbed higher, soaking his legs. The boat stopped moving. Jack looked over the side and froze. The lake was no longer reflecting the moonlight. Instead, it was black, endless, and filled with movement. Faces stared up at him from beneath the surface, their hollow eyes wide with anguish. Mouths opened in silent screams, their hands reaching for him. The boat gave one final, violent lurch, and Jack was thrown into the water. It was ice cold, and as he struggled to the surface, he felt hands gripping him, pulling him down. He thrashed and screamed, but the faces pressed closer, their expressions twisted with anger and sorrow. The last thing Jack saw before darkness consumed him was the boat drifting away, empty, its light flickering feebly in the fog. When morning came, the lake was calm again, its surface unmarred. Jack's boat was found drifting near the shore, in fact, his gear neatly stowed but his seat empty. The locals shook their heads when they heard the news, muttering about the curse. The lake keeps what it takes, always has. The town of Black Hollow had a peculiar tradition. No one stayed out past midnight on the edge of Deadwood Forest. The stories varied. Whispers of shadowy figures, strange lights, and a presence that stalked anyone daring enough to linger. Some dismissed it as folklore, but Maggie wasn't superstitious. When her friends dared her to camp near the forest's edge for one night, she accepted without hesitation. She set up her tent just before sunset, the golden light slanting through the twisted trees. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. As dusk deepened into night, Maggie lit a small fire and settled in, determined to prove her friends wrong. The first hour was uneventful. She read a book by the fire, the occasional crack of burning wood breaking the silence. But as the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, charged, and the trees seemed to loom closer. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like dry leaves brushing against one another. Maggie assumed it was the wind, but the air was still. The sound grew louder, coming from deep within the forest. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps. She stood, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Hello?" she called out, trying to sound confident. Her voice echoed, the silence swallowing it. There was no response, but the footsteps stopped. A chill ran down her spine. She scanned the tree line, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam caught movement, just a flicker, something darting between the trees. She whipped the light back, but whatever it was had vanished. Maggie forced a laugh. "It's just an animal," she muttered, trying to convince herself. She turned back to the fire and sat down, though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Minutes passed. The rustling began again, louder this time, circling her camp. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing her flashlight and a knife from her pack, she ventured to the edge of the clearing. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice firmer now. The forest responded with silence. Then, from the darkness, a whisper, "Maggie." She froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was soft, almost playful, but it came from the wrong direction, behind her. She spun around, shining her flashlight wildly. No one was there. "Maggie?" The voice said again, closer now, almost a giggle. Her breathing grew ragged as she backed toward her camp. The fire was sputtering, its light growing weaker. She glanced around, her flashlight beam darting nervously across the trees. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long and bent at wrong angles. Its face was pale, featureless save for two empty eye sockets that seemed to suck in the light. Maggie's legs refused to move, her body locked in place. The figure tilted its head, its bony hand raising slowly to point at her. It took a step forward, its movements jerky, as though it were unused to walking. The fire flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance along with the figure. Maggie finally found her voice. She screamed and bolted for her tent. But the moment she turned, she saw it again, standing directly in front of her, impossibly fast. Its empty eyes bore into hers, and, though it had no mouth, she heard its voice inside her head. "You shouldn't be here." She stumbled back, falling to the ground. The fire went out completely, plunging her into darkness. The figure loomed over her, its skeletal fingers reaching down. Maggie closed her eyes, bracing for the end. When she opened them again, it was morning. The sun bathed the clearing in soft light, and the forest was quiet once more. Her tent was gone, her gear scattered as if someone, or something, had torn through it. Maggie stood, her body sore, her mind reeling. She didn't remember falling asleep. She didn't remember leaving the clearing. When she returned to town, her friends laughed at her disheveled appearance, assuming she'd gotten spooked by the stories. But Maggie didn't argue. She never told them what she saw, what she heard. She moved out of Black Hollow a week later. But sometimes when she closes her eyes, she still hears the voice calling her name. And in her darkest moments, she feels those empty sockets watching, waiting. The rain had come suddenly, pounding on the roof of Daniel's car as he drove down the narrow, winding road. His headlights barely pierced the dense wall of rain, and the GPS had long since given up, leaving him with nothing but empty woods on either side of the road. He wasn't even sure where he was anymore. The sign for the bed and breakfast he was supposed to stay at had never appeared, and now his gas gauge was perilously low. He needed to stop, but there was nothing out here, nothing but trees and darkness. And then he saw it, a flickering light in the distance. Relief washed over him as he squinted through the rain. It was faint, barely visible through the downpour, but unmistakably a building. A house, maybe, with a single light glowing faintly in one of the windows. Daniel pulled over, parking at the edge of what looked like a long, overgrown driveway. He grabbed his coat and flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through his clothes instantly, chilling him to the bone. The house loomed ahead, shrouded in shadows and barely illuminated by the faint glow of the light. As he approached, he realized the place was far older than he'd thought. The wood was weathered and gray, the shutters hanging askew. The porch creaked under his weight as he stepped onto it. He hesitated, glancing back toward his car, but the rain was relentless and the night was pitch black. He knocked on the door. "Hello? Is anyone here?" No response. The wind howled, rattling the windows. Daniel tried the door, and to his surprise, it swung open with a groan. He hesitated again, but stepped inside, shaking off the rain. The interior was even more dilapidated than the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled stale, like wood and mildew. A staircase led upward, its banister broken in places. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing the cracked plaster beneath. But what struck him most was the silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Hello?" He called again, louder this time. His voice echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls in a way that made his skin crawl. He shone his flashlight around, the beam illuminating a doorway that led to what looked like a sitting room. And then he saw the light. It wasn't coming from a lamp or a bulb, as he'd thought. It was a candle, its flame flickering in the center of the room. The wax had melted into a misshapen lump as though it had been burning for hours. Beside it was a chair, facing away from him, its high back casting a long shadow on the wall. "Hello?" Daniel said again, his voice trembling now. He stepped closer, his wet shoes squeaking on the wooden floor. The chair was old, its fabric frayed and stained. The candle's flame wavered as though disturbed by his presence. He reached out to tap the chair, but before he could, a sound stopped him cold. A whisper. Low and guttural, it slithered through the air, unintelligible but undeniably there. Daniel whipped around, shining his flashlight into the corners of the room. The beam landed on a doorway leading deeper into the house, and he froze. Someone was standing there. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, its head nearly brushing the top of the doorframe. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Daniel could make out its long, thin limbs and the way it stood perfectly still, as though waiting for him to notice. He took a step back, his breath catching in his throat. I didn't mean to trespass," he stammered. "I'll leave." The figure didn't move. The whisper came again, louder this time, its source impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room like a cold wind. Daniel turned and bolted, heading for the door, but the house had changed. The doorway was gone, replaced by a blank, featureless wall. Panic surged through him as he spun in place. The figure was closer now, standing in the middle of the room. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. The candle's flame flared, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. "Please," Daniel begged, his voice barely audible over the whispering, which had grown into a deafening cacophony. "Please let me go!" The figure tilted its head, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, closing the distance between them in an instant. Daniel screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the whispering. The last thing he saw was its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only darkness, an empty void that pulled at him, consuming him. When the storm cleared the next morning, Daniel's car was found at the edge of the driveway, empty. His belongings were still inside, untouched, but there was no sign of him. The locals shook their heads when they heard the news. That house had been abandoned for decades, they said. Burned down years ago, nothing left but ashes. But on rainy nights, a single light is said to flicker in the distance, drawing in the lost, the desperate, and the curious. And none of them ever return. The old bridge in Ashton Woods had always been a place of whispered legends. Locals called it the Drowning Bridge, a spot shrouded in mystery and dread. They said the air grew colder as you approached it, even in the heat of summer, and that the water beneath was impossibly black. No one in town dared to linger near it after dark, but Emma wasn't from around there. Emma was a travel blogger who thrived on exploring offbeat locations, uncovering hidden gems, Blake, and debunking urban legends. When she heard the stories about the bridge, she dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. "Ghost stories sell," she laughed, packing her camera and notebook. She arrived just before sunset, the woods alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. The bridge was ancient, its wooden planks warped and moss-covered, the iron rails corroded with age. The air felt heavy, and she noticed the sudden drop in temperature as she approached, but she shook it off. Just the forest canopy, she told herself. Emma set up her tripod, taking photos of the bridge from various angles. The light was perfect, the golden hour casting long, dramatic shadows. The creek below gurgled softly, its surface reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. She ventured onto the bridge, the wood creaking ominously under her weight. The farther she walked, the quieter the world seemed to become. The sounds of the forest faded, replaced by a deep, almost imperceptible hum. Emma stopped in the middle of the bridge, unnerved by the sudden stillness. That's when she noticed it, a wet handprint on the railing. It wasn't just damp. Water dripped from the edges, forming small puddles on the wooden planks. She crouched down, running her fingers over the print. It was fresh, impossibly fresh, but there was no one else around. She stood quickly, her heartbeat quickening. "It's just water from the creek," she muttered, though her voice sounded hollow in the silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into twilight. She packed up her equipment, ready to leave, but as she turned back toward the car, she heard it. A soft splashing sound. It came from beneath the bridge. Emma hesitated, her curiosity warring with a growing sense of unease. She leaned over the railing, shining her flashlight into the water. The beam illuminated the dark creek, its surface rippling slightly. Then she saw it, a face staring back at her from beneath the surface. It wasn't just a reflection. The face was pale, its eyes wide and unblinking, its mouth slightly open as though gasping for air. Emma froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The face didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. A soft, gurgling voice rose from the water, so faint she thought she might be imagining it. "Help me." Emma's instinct was to run, but something in the voice rooted her in place. "Are you okay?" she called, her voice shaking. The face moved then, rising slowly from the water. Shoulders emerged, followed by spindly arms, the skin gray and bloated. Water cascaded from its form as it climbed onto the creek's edge, its movements unnatural, jerky. Emma backed away, her breaths coming in short gasps. "Stay back!" she shouted, but the figure continued to approach, its lifeless eyes fixed on her. It reached the bridge, its wet hands slapping against the planks as it pulled itself up. The air grew colder with each step it took, frost forming on the wooden rails. Emma turned and ran, her footsteps pounding against the creaking boards. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear it, those wet, dragging sounds following her, gaining on her. She reached the end of the bridge and stumbled into the woods, the undergrowth snagging at her clothes. Her car was just ahead, its silhouette barely visible in the fading light. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder. They seemed to come from every direction, overlapping, a cacophony of desperate voices. "Help us! Stay with us! Don't leave!" Emma reached the car, fumbling with her keys. Her hands trembled so badly that she dropped them, the metal jingling against the ground. She crouched to grab them, her flashlight beam catching movement in the trees. Dozens of figures stood in the shadows, their eyes glowing faintly. Some were dripping wet, their clothes tattered, while others looked eerily pristine, as though frozen in time. They stared at her, unmoving, their faces blank masks of sorrow. Emma finally got the door open and threw herself inside, slamming it shut. She locked the doors and started the engine, her headlights illuminating the bridge. It was empty. For a moment she thought she'd imagined it all. But as she reversed down the driveway, something wet and heavy slammed against her rear windshield. She screamed, hitting the gas, the car fishtailing on the dirt road. She didn't stop until she was miles away, the bridge long behind her. Emma never posted the photos she took that day. She deleted them all, but sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear the whispers. And every so often, when she looked in her rearview mirror, she'd catch a glimpse of those hollow eyes staring back at her. The town of Briar Glen had a secret, a graveyard hidden deep in the woods, untouched by time. Locals called it the Forgotten Hollow and warned visitors to stay away. "It's not the dead you need to worry about," they'd say. "It's the keeper." Marcus, a skeptic with a love for unraveling mysteries, wasn't deterred. He had come to Briar Glen specifically to explore the graveyard, armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. He brushed off the warnings as small-town superstition and followed the rough directions an old shopkeeper had reluctantly given him. The hike through the woods was uneventful at first. The path was overgrown, but manageable, the air heavy with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus noticed how quiet it had become. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of his boots on the forest floor. Finally, he found it. The graveyard was enclosed by a wrought iron fence, its black bars twisted and rusted with age. The gate creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing unnaturally. Inside, rows of weathered headstones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions worn smooth by time. Some graves had been overtaken by roots, the forest slowly reclaiming them. Marcus felt a strange unease as he stepped deeper into the graveyard, his flashlight casting long shadows. He told himself it was just the isolation, the eerie beauty of the place playing tricks on his mind. He began snapping pictures, jotting down notes about the unusual carvings on the headstones. And then he saw it. A grave near the center of the cemetery was different. Unlike the others, it was pristine, the stones smooth and polished as if it had been placed there recently. The name carved into it sent a chill down his spine. Marcus Carter, his own name. He laughed nervously, brushing it off as a coincidence or a prank. "Very funny," he muttered, though his voice sounded hollow in the still air. He reached out to touch the headstone, and the moment his fingers brushed the cold stone, the ground beneath his feet trembled. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural sound filled the graveyard. It wasn't an animal, nor the wind. It was something unnatural, something alive. Marcus spun around, shining his flashlight wildly. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to writhe, shifting as though they had a mind of their own. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The answer came not in words, but in movement. From the corner of his eye, he saw something emerge from the darkness. It was humanoid but impossibly tall, its body thin and stretched like it had been pulled from the earth itself. Its face was a hollow void, a black abyss where features should have been. Its long arms ended in claw-like fingers that scraped the ground as it moved. The Keeper. Marcus stumbled backward, tripping over a broken headstone. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching unnaturally long, reaching for him. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he weaved through the graves. The whispers started then. Faint at first, but growing louder with each step he took. They came from all around him, voices overlapping in a maddening chorus. "Stay. Rest. It's your time." He reached the gate and threw it open, the metal screeching loudly. As he sprinted into the woods, the whispers faded, but he didn't stop running until he reached his car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the keys, glancing back toward the path. Nothing. Just the quiet woods. Marcus drove straight to his motel, his mind racing. He tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Maybe it was exhaustion or some strange trick of the light. But deep down, he knew it was real. Later that night, as he sat on the edge of his bed, reviewing the photos on his camera, his breath caught in his throat. Most of the images were as expected. Headstones, overgrown graves. But in every frame, lurking in the background, was the shadowy figure. In the final photo, the one of the polished headstone, it was standing directly behind him. Marcus packed his things and left Briar Glen before sunrise. But no matter where he went, the whispers followed. In his dreams, in the silence of his apartment, and sometimes, faintly, in the static of his phone. And every so often, when he caught his reflection, he swore he saw his shadow move before he did.